Kapi meni ki ai te wahi ngaro nāna nei te ora ko hama te whakaro nui ki a tātou te tangata. Ka tuki nā meni ki ngā haukainga ngā tangata whenua tēnei wāhi. Ko te mea tuatahi, nāna e hanga i ngā mea tātou. Kia koutou i tāmai nei, ngā mihi ki ngui ki a koutou, ki tēnei kaupapa, nau mai haere mai. Ko marama tuku i mua, no Aotearoa hau. I'm going to go into English now for you. I just welcomed you, but I welcomed you into this space that will pass to Jessica, but just to translate what I have said is that I thank you all for coming to support tonight's gathering, and I also acknowledge the original owners of the land, the Ngāti people, and from all that came from them.
Marma. Hi everyone, welcome to Cooper Union in this giant auditorium. Thank you for coming out on, what is it, Monday night? I don't know, I've been here for a long time now. Okay, so my name is Jessica Whitbread. I'm the Community Relations and Mobilization Manager for the International Community of Women Living with HIV, and I will be the moderator for this evening. I will try to talk a little, but I will try. So this is a really important panel discussion that we're having here on reproductive justice. It's something that I think that in different movements happens, but we're often disconnected from each other. So this evening, we are going to be talking from people from different places, spaces, and times, and different movements about some of the activism that has been happening within a reproductive justice framework. Everyone will introduce them. I should not what you said. Everyone's going to introduce themselves and their bodies of work and where they come from and kind of their place in history. Just a bit of logistics. We are filming this evening, so if anyone doesn't want to be filmed, I don't think you're going to be seen on the film.
You won't be seen, but if you want to speak up and if there's anything you don't want recorded, we can just hit pause so that your secrets are safe.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm the student organizer, so bathrooms are over there. If you guys have any emergencies, I'm right here. Okay, into the top.
You're free to go pee whenever you'd like. We won't be offended. So I think that, so the title of this session is called My Wound, My Decisions. No, I wrote it and then I can never remember it. Stories of Sexual and Reproductive Justice and Activism. I am super excited for each of the panelists to introduce themselves and then talk a bit about their kind of bodies of work afterwards.
You've already heard my name, and I actually am here in the capacity of the International Indigenous Working Group on HIV/AIDS, which has 11 or 12 countries.
Good evening. My name is Teresia Otieno from Kenya. I'm from the International Community of Women Living with HIV. I do a lot of community work, education at the community level, advocacy work at Kenya, at the region, and also at the global level. I'm a woman living with HIV.
I'm Karen Stam. Many years ago, I was an activist with the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse, and then the Committee for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse. I live here in New York City.
Hi, my name is Justus Eisfeld. I'm co-director of Global Action for Trans Equality. We work for trans rights at the global level, support trans movements worldwide, and make critical knowledge and resources available to activists. And I'm also also live here in New York, but I'm from Europe originally.
Now the microphone is far. So to start off, so as you can see, we have a really rich panel, but I also want to acknowledge that we have a lot of richness in the room. A lot of people, one of the reasons we're so fortunate to have all of us together, it's the 59th Commission on the Status of Women happening right now at the UN. So, you know, it's very cost effective to have such a star-studded panel as such here for you tonight. So we're going to begin by talking a bit about the history in a local context, and Karen is going to talk about her experiences doing organizing and activism on the ground.
Is this on? Yes, is it on now?
Yeah.
Yes.
People hear me? Okay. The history of sterilization and sterilization abuse in the U.S. goes back a long way. Beginning in the earlier part of the last century, we had here a eugenics movement which sponsored, among other things, what you might call forced sterilization laws in 37 states and the territory of Puerto Rico. There were various organizations that carried on this work, something called the Human Betterment Association, which somehow believed that through genetics, the human race could be made happier. And that was the positive side of eugenics. And they were interested in, as Margaret Sanger said, more children from the fit, less from the unfit. That was the chief issue of birth control. But I brought up her name deliberately because many people who were supportive of eugenics in the earlier part of the 20th century were actually somewhat progressive. It was not the way you would view it today as a definitely oppressive and right-wing activity. It reached its height somewhere around 1927 when the Supreme Court gave its approval of these laws, saying 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And what was actually going on here is that people who were either in a disfavored group or people who suffered the effects of poverty were thought to be people who carried those traits genetically. So people who suffered epilepsy, people who were mentally ill, people who were developmentally disabled, people who had criminal convictions. Many people in those groups were sought to be involuntarily sterilized. This movement actually reached its zenith in Nazi Germany, as you probably know, and that, of course, discredited a lot of the overtly forcible programs. But some of it still lingered on in another way, which I'll come to in a minute. So at the end of World War II, a lot of this activity was really quiet. And then it cropped up again in the 1970s in another form, and that is in conjunction with Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, which was, you know, a book that basically said the world is terribly overpopulated, and the only way we could deal with pollution and unrest in the world is to have massive, coercive birth control, sterilization programs. Now we're in the 1970s. The Supreme Court has recognized the right to, somewhat anyway, to reproductive autonomy, the right to privacy, and the two really begin to collide. So we have an abortion rights movement that is, I think, somewhat indiscriminate in how it chooses its friends. It allied itself with some of these population groups, which made it really impossible to draw into that movement women who might have been the targets of some of those programs. CESA was, the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse, was formed in the early 1970s in response to several very well publicized cases of overtly forced sterilization, particularly down south, where women were told if they wanted to keep on getting welfare benefits, they would have to agree to sterilization, or women were approached when they were in labor. One person here in New York was told while she was in prison that she could have a tubal ligation and get her tubes untied when she became a good girl again. So you get a feeling for what was going on. At the same time that was going on, doctors were saying to women who asked for sterilizations that they could only have them if the number of their children times their age equaled 120. Okay. Yeah, it does seem ridiculous in today's world, but that was the age at which doctors were actually making social policy in the operating room or in their offices, you know, not in consultation with anybody else. So, I have to tell you a little bit about SESA because I think SESA was a remarkable organization for several reasons. The first one is that the people who formed it came from a wide variety of backgrounds. One of those backgrounds was healthcare workers. There were lots of people in there who worked on the front lines in the hospitals, counseling people, and so on. And there were others who were in the bureaucracy of our Health and Hospitals Corporation, which is what runs the public hospitals here in New York. Our system here is actually the second largest public hospital system in the country after the VA. Many of those people had a background in what you might call the old left. I'm talking about parties like the Communist Party and its affiliates or its satellite organizations. They had excellent organizational skills. And that made a huge difference. And they knew exactly how the health system worked. They knew where its weak points were. They knew how to organize within it. Also in SESA were many attorneys, civil rights attorneys, legal aid attorneys, feminists. So this was a very diverse organization that agreed on its central theme. And we had a three-part agenda. The first part was to enact a series of guidelines that would provide true informed consent for people seeking sterilization. So people had to be given information on risks, benefits, alternatives in their own languages at a time when they could reflect and not be under pressure. So nobody could be approached while they were in labor or seeking an abortion. Counseling had to be done by a non-doctor because it was understood that doctors were too intimidating sometimes and just in too much of a hurry to spend the necessary time on counseling. It had a monitoring component so we could keep track of exactly how many procedures were taking place, where, and under what conditions. And it had a waiting period. So 30 days had to elapse between consent and procedure. This turned out to be extremely controversial. The doctors were up in arms about it. And the population agencies, which many of you may actually know, and at that time had a somewhat different character, like Planned Parenthood, were against it. Something called the Association for Voluntary Sterilization was against it. And that's interesting because this AVS organization used to have a different name. It was the Human Betterment Association. So you can see it sort of morphs over time. And other organizations that you may know, like NARAP, for example, were in opposition. NARAP is the national, or was, the National Abortion Rights Action League. It may have a different, it has the same acronym, but it may have a slightly different name now. Anyway, that was our first very concrete point. Our second one was that we wanted to redefine choice, the word choice, the process of choice. And that was because the abortion rights folks talk about the right to choose as nothing more than a legal right. And I think everybody probably understands that without the legal right, it's a whole lot harder. But there's so much more to choice than simply a legal right. Oh, I left out something very important. I'm sorry, I need to go back. The other impetus for forming SESA came from the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, which was for Puerto Rican independence. And many people may know that at that point, about 35% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age had been sterilized. Now, I don't mean here in New York, I mean on the island of Puerto Rico. So you ask, well, how did that happen? How did such a thing come to be? And the answer really is, I think, very illuminating about how you have to define choice. There wasn't a lot of choice. That's really the point. Abortion was unavailable. There was not a lot of child care. Women had to work. The health system was not very generous. There was a government-sponsored program that favored sterilization above all other methods. And there was a lot of pressure from the church and societal or familial pressure not to use condoms. So that's how it occurred. So the answer really is that choice means having available not just one thing, but it means having all the modalities that you would be interested in available, all the economic supports, all the emotional supports, and of course, everything being equal in the eyes of the law. That begins to approach what free choice really is about, and now we're talking about social conditions, not simply a change in a statute. The other thing that was very important to SESA was to dissociate those population agencies or their descendants from women's groups and women's health groups and feminist groups. They were, in a sense, hiding behind women's groups. They were hiding behind environmental groups, like something like CPG, the zero population, whatever it was, that would say things like people pollute, too many people, too much pollution. So the implication is clear that the environment, to clean up the environment, it becomes necessary that we enact certain kinds of coercive programs. What did we do? Well, the first thing that we actually did was we went to the community boards of the public hospitals, because all of the facilities within HHC here have a community component. That was the first place we went, where neighborhood folks would understand what has been happening and they would support this program, which they did. We also sort of split ourselves in two, in a way. We had an inside component, which was drafting the regulations, and we had an outside component, which was SESA, that went to every radio show that invited us, every street fair, every place you could find us. Especially to women's health groups and healthcare workers who intimately understood what the problem was. And so we sort of played good cop, bad cop a little bit with these two groups, and that worked extremely well. Whenever the inside people needed some public pressure, we could provide that with a demonstration, we could go to the press. Ultimately, we did a lot of lobbying in the city council, and then ultimately for national guidelines that govern all sterilizations within Medicaid and the Indian Health Service. So in that sense, it was successful. But come 1977, we had the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment was the congressional enactment that forbids the use of federal funds for abortion. And we saw this as an emergency, a huge emergency meeting. Hundreds of people actually showed up on the night of this event, and it was almost spontaneous. And SESA's reason for being there was that true choice obviously couldn't be preserved if only one modality, like sterilization, is funded 90% by the federal government, and abortion is not going to be funded at all. I mean, that's just the clearest, piece of steering that one might think of. Carassa carried forward, I think, this expanded notion of choice. It was a really big organization. Our conferences routinely had 300, 400 people. We had all kinds of committees, child care committees, legislative committees, research committees. There was a lesbian committee. I can't even remember what the committees anymore. There were at least 10 or 12 of them. And everybody had a role, you know, in terms of their presentation in seeking legislation or a new platform to carry forward what we were doing. Many of the things actually coalesced in a book that was written by various academically oriented people within Carassa. And it was called Women Under Attack. It first came out in 1979, and then it came out again as a revised version in 1989. And the reason it's important is because it was used by women's studies courses in colleges throughout the metropolitan area, so that everybody, you know, who took the course would at least be exposed to these kinds of ideas. As for, you know, how I would evaluate whether or not we were ultimately successful in what we did, in 1991, I went to a conference at Hostos College, and a lot of the original CESA people were there. And I heard the discussion about the guidelines and how people were implementing them. And it was real clear this whole controversial project had become part of the landscape of healthcare delivery. So I thought, okay, job well done. You know, we've turned it over to a whole bunch of other people. They'll carry it forward. That's really great. The other parts of it are much harder to measure. I don't hear about the same kinds of forced sterilizations that we used to hear about. I'm not sure that's really definitive. The numbers haven't changed. We have that monitoring component. So we know that even though there's informed consent for sterilization here in New York, that it's not clear to me that anything, you know, in the distribution has changed. The ethnic breakdown is roughly the same today, not today, but in the 90s as what it was in the 70s. The only thing I can be sure that was eliminated was younger people under 21 were not getting sterilized, for example. But I think the discourse has changed. I think we wouldn't be talking about reproductive justice, for example, in a broad way if these ideas hadn't filtered out, you know, and taken root among other people. So that's really the great thing, is that it's never going to get reduced again, you know, to just a single, very narrow little issue that can cover up all kinds of injustices and really bad distributions of benefits and burdens. I'm here, among other things, to find out what's going on in the rest of the world in these areas, because I've lost a little bit of touch. I'm sure things have changed enough that, you know, the old problems are still there, but in a different guise.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that history, and I don't know, it's just like, I just wanted to know more, and I think it's interesting because, like, you know, it's interesting how it shifts from one population to another, which we will talk about some very, very recent stuff in the here and now. I'd like to invite Marma to talk about, you know, especially something that's so close to home here, Indigenous people and reproductive justice in that context.
Thank you, Jessica. Can you hear me all right? I'll make you jump up and sing a song. Where I come from, I'm from New Zealand, so my heritage is Māori, which is Polynesian. And we are a very small race of people when you look at the rest of the world. And in that sense, I'm going to explain to you or take you on a bit of a journey on why I'm wearing this scarf around my waist. Because we're a visual people. People from the Pacific Islands, they like to see things and then they understand it. And the reason that I'm wearing it is that over the process of the last 200 years that we've been colonised, and there's a lot of colonial amnesia around what happened to us. And what happened as far as why we do this is that whenever we do something like I did earlier, we open ourselves up for attack. And back on a marae, or back on our sort of communal areas or reservations or whatever you want to call them, when someone came to visit us, when they came onto the ground in front of us, we were aware that we could be attacked by them. And in our processes, it was always about protecting, and I'll say it in my language and then I'll explain it, the whare tangata. And the whare tangata is the place of man. And the place of man is the womb. So the woman would wear something that would cover their womb to protect their womb, and the men would stand in front with their spears or whatever they had, their weapons, and if everyone seen the haka. You watch rugby, people know what rugby is, and New Zealand rugby team, the haka. Well, that whole process of what they're doing is about protecting the whare tangata. So traditionally, the reproductive rights, or the reproductive organs of a woman were incredibly important because it meant the survival of the race. Now, over a course of around 80 years, from sort of 1880 to not the 1900s, we went from a population of 600,000 down to 40,000. And this was due to the fact that introduced diseases came along, such as smallpox, influenza, and it wiped out a lot of us. And again, there was that whole process of if the whare tangata or the womb wasn't protected, how would we survive? So this is the journey I'm telling you about. What has happened in the last 100 years is that through the assimilation or colonisation, I'm speaking for my people, but there will be some sort of similarities and differences to other Indigenous cultures, and the introduction of health systems and doctors and nurses and the whole system that was totally alien to us, because we actually had our own healing processes and our own traditional medicines and traditional doctors. All of a sudden it was introduced this completely different way. And we were told that we couldn't live communally anymore, that we had to move into separate little houses because it was unsanitary. So the Public Health Act separated us from living as a group in a village and put us in little wee houses. And then the toilet and the place where we, let everything go was put inside that house. And that was another concept for us that we didn't do, because the house, or our living quarters where we slept in our village, was representative of the whare tangata, of the womb. So when you walk into a meeting house, they're shaped like this, and the door that you're walking through is the womb. So when you're sleeping in the house, you're sleeping in your mother, like you're sleeping in your womb. Then all of a sudden that was taken away from us, and we had to go into these houses. And the thing we couldn't understand is that all of a sudden we had to cook in that house and use the toilet. So that was a real new concept for us, because we had a cook house where people would all cook in the same place and share their food. So there was a whole lot of sort of introduced things that were new to us. Bringing it back a few more generations, I'll share my mother's story. She was a runaway child, what they call a runaway child. So she was running away from police and foster care systems. She was living on the streets, and she got pregnant with my sister. Now, so I'm personalising the story so you get a bit more understanding. She was 17 years old, and she was considered unmarried Māori woman, and the social welfare system decided to intervene and take the child from her. So this kind of forced adoption happened right through Indigenous cultures, and incredibly more so in Aboriginal Australia, with the stolen generation they're called now, where a lot of children were taken. So my sister was taken. When she got pregnant with me, she ran away and hid, and she hid with the the queens in the red light district. She stayed with the people that would look after her, which was the people that knew how to hide as well. So her support systems were, we've got a place called K Road in New Zealand. So if you've ever been to New Zealand, K Road is the place to go. And it has everything, all the sex workers were there, all the places. So my mother hid in the red light district because that way she couldn't be found. So she gave birth to me. At the age of 36, she was sterilised. And basically, they didn't know what was wrong with her because she had a lot of physical things going on. So the doctors decided, well, let's just take the uterus out. And that will fix it, and it never did. There was always something. So to me, it was an example of one woman's journey that has actually happened quite a lot within Indigenous culture. I know a lot of women that have had that happen too. Bringing it back to myself, I was diagnosed with HIV in '93, and back then it was a death sentence, but it was also forget having children. And from a cultural perspective, I was brought up with a lot of knowledge that was passed on from my grandmother and so forth. And that meant that I had no one to pass the knowledge and the land that we still have onto, so that it ended the line, it ended my line. And that was, to me, was worse than being diagnosed with HIV. So for me and the doctors, I trusted those doctors. And what we as Indigenous people, we have very little trust of colonising systems. So when a doctor, for us, going to the doctor or going to the hospital means death. We're going to die. And so we had that, we're very, we don't trust them, and we don't trust the processes that happen, and so we avoid the doctors at every single cost that we can do. However, when you get HIV, that doesn't work. You have to go all the time. You always have to get blood tests, you always have to have this checkup, have a smear, have a this, have a that. And so for me, I was forced into this kind of system of being checked all the time. And also, I didn't have children for 12 years. And then someone finally said, oh, you can have a baby. And I went, oh, thanks for telling me. And so I didn't feel like I had any sort of control over my own reproductive organs. But I did. I've had 2 children since then, and both of them are HIV negative. However, the process, I'm explaining it from my personal point of view, but I have friends in many places, in Canada, America, Australia, South America, who've been through similar situations. It was suggested very strongly that I be sterilised. When I had my son, now, I became very, very ill and almost died giving birth to him. And their answer was, well, sterilise you. And yet there was actually no sort of logical, medical term or reason or explanation on why they thought that was the best thing to do. To them, they think, I'm getting old, get rid of the worm, stop periods, go into menopause, I'm so medicalised anyway, I'm this biomedical thing that they want to change. And I didn't really feel like I had a choice. But in saying that, the Indigenous activist within me was questioning that doctor. In fact, I put up such an argument that I wouldn't let them put me under when they gave me a cesarean. I was making sure that they didn't do anything they shouldn't. And I had people there to make sure that they didn't. And they didn't, which was I'm quite grateful to. But it's understanding that I can do that, but there are a lot of Indigenous women out there that can't. And I think that's the message that I'm here to pass on, is that we can't all stand up for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. I think I was just reflecting a lot on choice and just like how evil like the system can be, and I just want to thank you for sharing your experience. And that was a perfect segue into Teresa, who is a woman living with HIV in Kenya, who has been highly active in the recent court cases around forced and coerced sterilization in the country and doing global activism around that as well.
Good evening once again. I'm from the International Community of Women Living with HIV in the board, and recently I was the global chair until last December. One of the things that we are very concerned of as the International Community of Women Living with HIV, as the only global network by and for women living with HIV, is the fact that we must take the lead in advocating for our sexual reproductive health and rights. And one of our strategic direction really is on sexual reproductive health and rights, and sterilization is one of our focus. So this is a topic that is quite of interest for us as a network, and we are taking lead to ensure that the world will know what is happening among women living with HIV. And really, listening to you is like a replicated kind of discrimination and stigma. Like we say, we are 30 years into the epidemic, but we have discrimination and stigma reborn in a different way. And sterilization is one of the ways that we are seeing as women living with HIV. We've been interested in the issue since 2005, when the first cases of sterilization were reported in different parts of the world, like Southern Africa. And in 2008, we had women who went to court cases in South Africa, and they reported that they were forcefully sterilized. Why? Because of various reasons that we are going to talk about in a while. However, we know that those cases did not go well, that they did not continue, because some of the women decided that they wanted to have a resettlement out of courts, maybe because of fear of the system, and also, you know, in parts of Southern Africa, there were issues to do with discrimination in other ways, in color and race. So one of the things that we are keen to do is to ensure we are involved in litigation, in advocacy, in research, and also in media engagement to make sure that the world knows that women living with HIV are still continue to be sterilized. I want to give an experience of what is happening in Kenya, because that is where I've worked a lot in the community with women living with HIV. It is not a medical practice or procedure to sterilize women living with HIV. And indeed, we've done our research. There is no single policy that says that women living with HIV should be sterilized. Having said that, the National Family Planning Guidelines is very clear when it comes to informed consent. And it says that women must be given counseling, they should be counseled, then they should be given an opportunity to sign the form, the informed consent form, if they want to be sterilized. The other thing is clear that women should be able to discuss with their spouses or partners if they are to have sterilization, and the partner must sign the informed consent form. So very clear in the national policy and guidelines. So definitely in a country like Kenya in Africa, we have enabling legal and policy environment. But that does not translate into enabling social environment, because we still continue to see cases of women being sterilized. In 2010, the International Community of Women Living with HIV, ICW East Africa, brought together women in Kenya to talk about sexual reproductive health. And one of the key issues was about women living with HIV enjoying their sexuality, because we were from an era where women were dying, they were not enjoying their sexuality, they could not even have husbands, some of them, because we didn't even have access to treatment, and that was somehow the most important thing. So coming from that era of not accessing treatment, we thought it is the point now to talk about our sexuality. And unfortunately, most women talked about how unfair the system has been in deciding for them on how many children that they should give birth to. And so one of the areas that we decided to do is to document these experiences, and that's why as ICW we are sort of like interested in research. We documented experiences of women living with HIV. That was done in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, as well as in Asia Pacific and in Mexico. One of the findings that we found is that the women living with HIV who are being sterilized are from poor settings. So it's not just any other woman who goes to the hospital, gets sterilized if they are HIV positive, or any other woman. But if you're from the slum or you're not working, then sterilization was seen as an option. The other thing is that there was a specific target to specific age group of women, and these were very young women who were being targeted as targets of being sterilized. So this happened mainly in mostly public hospitals as well as in a few private hospitals. So one of the trends why women were being sterilized during this research that we undertook or during the documentation is that we found that women, when they went to give birth, they were taken for emergency cesarean section, and during that procedure, then they were sterilized without their knowledge. And most of the women came to know about it so many years, like 10 years or 5 years or a year, or even the next day after cesarean section. And that was traumatizing for the women. But also, we also understand that they were also living with HIV, so there was that compromising situation. Another situation is the consent was taken during labor. So if someone has given birth here, you understand that that is a situation where a woman is not in a position to give informed consent. Because there are other underlying issues, there are other concerns, there are other fears that are there, that a woman is thinking about. So there's need to not to give them that opportunity to give consent of sterilization when they are in labor. And that is what happened to some of the women that we talked to. The other thing is that we know that in Africa, really, there is a lot of issues in terms of economic empowerment for both men and women. And really, some of the women living with HIV live in poverty. And so the system is somehow taking advantage of their situation as women and telling them, if we have to support you to give milk for your child, of course, because women then, we didn't know that they can breastfeed their child, but if we need to support you with milk, or if we have to pay your hospital bill, then you have to sign this form for you to be sterilized. And then you get everything, including food for the other children at home. And we know what will happen with women. They will say, I want this baby, I want to take care of my child, so I would rather sign this consent form. And so really, we know that that is coercion of the highest order. The other point is that women were being given misinformation. They were given, they were being misinformed by health workers. How? Because when I'm told, because I'm HIV positive, when I'm told if I continue giving birth to another child, I'm going to die. So this puts me in an awkward situation in the first place. And so I start thinking, if I have already one child, or already I have this child I want to give birth to, I don't want to die, I want to take care of this child. Yet we know that is not true. Women were told that if you give birth again, then your immunity will go down and you will be bedridden. And that is not what women wanted. So this kind of misinformation really made some women to sign those consent forms, and to us that was coercion. The health workers also had beliefs that some women had so many children, like a woman should not have more than 2 children, and that relates well to what you were saying, that maybe women living with HIV should not even have 1 child, or if they already have a child, 1 or 2, that is the end. They should not continue giving birth to children. And another thing is the fact that some of the women we talked to were like disabled, mentally and also physically disabled. And we know that some of them wanted to have children because they have a right to exercise their reproductive health rights. But when they presented themselves to the health workers when they're pregnant, one of the women was asked, which one of your problems are we going to solve? You are blind, you are pregnant, and you're HIV positive. So, and she didn't know what to do, and she said, I had planned for this child. I don't want to be blind and lonely forever. I want to have a child who can support me. And immediately she was set aside into the theater. The doctors went to talk to her mother, and the mother signed for her. And she was sterilized inside that cesarean room or operation room. And that was also another trend, you know, like talking to spouses of these women living with HIV, talking to their parents and saying, no, if you don't sign for them now, they are going to die. And my mom would not want to see me die. My husband would not want me to die. And so he would sign very fast. So those are some of the trends that we found. I remember I have 2 children. One is 15, the other one is about 7. I remember when I was giving birth to my last child, and I was already in the movement. I was teaching women. I was empowering women on their reproductive health rights. I went to the hospital to give birth, and my doctor, a personal doctor, told me that I need to have a cesarean section. And I knew that was the right thing because I'm infected. I don't want to infect my child. And so a CES would be the right thing for me. The moment I was inside the room, and I think she had put the anesthesia medication, my doctor was busy whispering to me, and I'm going to sterilize you. You know, like they say, TL, we're going to do TL. So in my mind already, you know, I was afraid that I might even, I don't know why I was thinking I might die on that table. I was afraid that I might die giving birth. The other thing is that I was afraid that I might infect HIV to my child. And my doctor was busy telling me she's going to sterilize me. So actually that was less of my concern. Until the following day when she came with a form, you know, like when I regained conscious, and she told me, sign here, I told you I'm going to sterilize you. Then I was like, oh yeah, what happened? And then she told me, I already did. And to me, that ignited a sense of something must be done. We must talk to women. And indeed, when we talked to other women, this was happening all over. Because I thought I was educated. I thought I had the information. I even thought that I can fight for my rights. But inside that room, in that table, I was defenseless. I could not talk. I could not even think. And I could do nothing. And I was paralyzed. So, so this is happening, and it is really impacting negatively on women. We know that most women have been experience gender-based violence because of being sterilized. In our African context, which is quite different from this side, is that if a woman is not able to give birth, then their place within the society is no more. Especially if you're a woman, young woman, and you're married. And when we were talking to most women, they were 21 years when they were sterilized. One of the women was sterilized when she was 21 years, and that was her first child. And immediately she was sterilized. The child, before she was 1 year, she died. And so the child became, the woman became childless, and she was already married. But now, as we continue with access to treatment, she has not died. She continued to be beautiful. She wanted to stay with her husband, but unfortunately she was deserted by the man. Why? Because the man wants children and she cannot continue. She cannot give him children. Women also are disinherited because inheritance is sort of connected to the many children you have within our society. And so we see that loss of property for women is an issue, especially women living with HIV, because they are not able to give birth. However, the most worst thing is the fact that women are physically abused for those who cannot be disinherited because of their situation, because they cannot give birth, and because the society somehow expects them to be like child-bearing machines. And one thing they think is that you are HIV positive, you cannot give birth, so what is your place within the society? And so women living with HIV who have been sterilized find themselves facing double stigma within the society. So I want to say that there have been like voices of women living with HIV on the issue, but there also have been challenges. And one of the areas is that most people don't even think that violations of sexual reproductive health rights, including sterilization, is an issue for women living with HIV. And everybody thinks we should be concerned about access to treatment. We should be concerned of nutrition, as if sexual reproductive health is not important. Women living with HIV have tried to litigate on the issue. In Namibia, maybe some of you read about the cases, women took the government to court because of being sterilized, because of their HIV status. And the court ruled in their favor. Unfortunately, the government there took back the court case, but the women won still, and the government and the court said that the women were sterilized because of their HIV status. The other thing is that there have been a lot of talks, like talks, because everybody talks about the issue. It has been there since the 1970s. It had continued even in the 1990s. We continue to talk about the same, the issue of forced and coerced sterilization. But the worst thing is that even having said that, having come out in 2010 about forced and coerced sterilization, women right now are being sterilized in my country, where I come from. Something unacceptable. Yet the health workers, the governments stand and say it is not our policy. We are going to jail anybody who sterilizes women. But they are doing nothing actually to sort of talk to the doctors, to train them, and to ensure that the rights of women living with HIV are respected. So what are some of the things that I see myself, or what should we do, like as a movement? What can you and me do to ensure that the rights of women living with HIV are respected? I think in my sense that the issue of consent is not reinforced well. And so there is need to reinforce that in whatever country we come from. I like what you talked about, like there should be a time of when a woman is cancelled, like you need to be sterilized, because it is a good form of family planning, and the time that they are actually sterilized. For the woman to think through, to see whether this is something that I need to do. And then they are given that form to go and discuss it at home and see whether they want to be sterilized. But however, there is a need for public education on reproductive health and rights and justice for women living with HIV, both to women themselves. Why? Because even the women that we talked to, those who are living with HIV, they never thought as if that is a violation of their rights. Why? Because at home, the doctor is a small god, and whatever the doctor says makes sense. So whatever as a network we try to say or teach women, it does not make sense so long as the doctor says you need to be sterilized. And so we found ourselves in an awkward situation trying to educate the women that you have a right to choose. You have a right to choose whatever family planning method you want to use. You have a right to choose how many children you want to have, with who, and when to stop. And so it was like an uphill task, because talking to our women, we thought we are going to go together. So there's their need of educating our women so that they can understand their reproductive health rights and be able to demand for these rights wherever they are and whichever country they come from. But also there's need to have comprehensive advocacy that will benefit women living with HIV. And mostly this is to hold the authorities accountable. Because if we don't do that, then we continue the talk. And Jessica talked about that we are here at the Commission of the Status of Women. And I've come to that commission, like this is another time I've come. And we talk about the same thing, the rights of women, reproductive justice. And we continue to talk and talk and talk. But we need to act now. And so to act, maybe you'll tell us what we need to do, but I feel as if they're doing things not more aggressively, or there's something else that we need to do. But for sure, as a woman living with HIV who have been sterilized, I know it is a violation of women's rights and it should not happen. No woman should face similar situation that I did and other women who don't know have faced. Thank you.
I think it's true. The conversations are like the same ones over and over, and yeah, they're frustrating. I've definitely been in them. I think right now, one thing that I want to be conscious of is opening our understanding of who is sterilized and exploring gender a little bit more. We've been talking about like women, but what does that mean? And you know, Eustace, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to start with a question to you all. How many of you had to show some kind of identity document in the last week? That's pretty much all, 90% of us. I guess we could go to 100% within the last month. Now imagine your identity document reads a name and a gender that is not your own, that doesn't look anywhere near what you look like, that people will raise their eyebrows. In most places in the world, in order to be able to change that identity document into one that represents you, if your country allows you to change your identity documents in the first place. But in those countries that do, in order to be able to do that, the vast majority of countries and jurisdictions require that you be sterilized. That is a pretty strong incentive, and I believe it's coercion. I started being a trans activist when I transitioned myself and decided to go by the name of Justus, which is a male name in German, where I come from. And in order to be able to change my birth certificate, my passport, my identity documentation, my driver's license, you know, everything, my government required for me to having the strong conviction of belonging to the gender that I belong to, and requiring proof through an expert opinion. It required me to be adjusted as much as possible physically to my preferred gender. And on top of that, it required for me to be irreversibly infertile. So, on top of that, I transitioned through a publicly funded healthcare system that paid for hormones and that paid for surgeries, which I'm very grateful for. But it also came with a very long waiting list. And for every single surgery that I wanted to have, I had to wait years. But there was one surgery that was very readily available, and that was the hysterectomy, that I could basically do, you know, immediately. That was the only surgery that wasn't scrutinized to death about why I wanted to have this horrible surgery. But was actually encouraged. I was encouraged to have that surgery. I was told that because I was using male hormones, that there may be an increased cancer risk, which there hasn't been any physical proof of. There has never been a proof of an increased risk for cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, testicular cancer, and trans people who take hormones of their preferred gender. But that's what my doctors told me. So so I had the surgery, and that was sort of my entry point into trans activism. I was a lesbian activist before I transitioned, I did all kinds of organizing in the Students' Union. And when I came out as trans and when I transitioned myself, I tried to find a common cause that all the fractious trans groups in my country, which was the Netherlands at the time, could come and rally together around. And I felt that this law that prescribed what our bodies have to look like in order to be able to identify ourselves when we wanted to go to a bar and drink, or buy a cell phone, or rent a house, or have a new job, or actually identify ourselves at our health clinic. That law would be a good point to rally the groups together. And when I started to voice that idea in the trans support group that I went to, people were like, "What do you mean there's a sterilization requirement?" No, that's just the law. That's how it is. I mean, this is just a process. And once I started to use the term sterilization, people started to think, "Oh, maybe there is something wrong with this. Maybe this isn't quite the way it's supposed to be." It took until half a year ago to change that law. I started working around this in about 2004, so it's been 11 years. New York City just changed their requirements for a legal gender change last month, I think, 2 months ago. So this is not something that's ancient history. This is something that's happening right now. The reasons that we were given for the sterilization requirement, I think there's several pathways that convene here, and some pathways are similar to what you've described. There's certainly a eugenics argument and this, a connotation of mental illness, that if you're trans, you have to be mentally ill, which, by the way, is something that the World Health Organization is starting to question, and they propose to take gender identity disorder out of the list of mental diseases. The cancer risk, this imaginary cancer risk I already talked about. But these laws were, the way they came into being was the first people who medically transitioned from one gender to another in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s did so pretty much under the radar. There were only a handful of people. Only when Christine Jorgensen came out in the US in the 1950s, it became a little more mainstream. And by the 70s, there were enough people who had transitioned that it was clear to lawmakers that something needed to happen. And so in the 70s and 80s, the first laws came into being. And at the time, what the lawmakers did, they went to the doctors and asked them, "Well, what should we do?" And the doctor said, "Well, this is the medical protocol that we follow. So why don't you just turn that into law? Once people have followed this medical protocol, have taken every single step that we can imagine, then they're true and tried transsexuals and should get the seal of approval of the state." There's a very unfortunate commingling of medical protocols on the one hand and legal standards on the other hand, and those are extremely difficult to disassemble, both in the minds of lawmakers, in the minds of healthcare professionals, and in the minds of trans people. So when I started this work, a lot of trans people were like, "Yeah, this is just the way it is. It's been like this all the time, There was very little questioning of what being transgender means, and at the time in the Netherlands where I was, being transgender meant that had to want to undergo every single medical procedure known to mankind. Now, fortunately, we know that we are all individuals, and that what works for one person may or may not work for the other. But that's not how doctors like to see us, and that's not how trans people portrayed ourselves, because many of us needed that access to those surgeries and to those hormones, and felt that they had to prescribe to that medical model that our doctors were giving to us in order to be able to access the things that we needed to access. So, trust in doctors is a huge issue also for trans people. Not just the doctors who are not in a position to enable transition-related healthcare to us, but also doctors who have nothing to do with medical aspects of our transition, general practitioners. A lot of trans people go to healthcare providers and are met with distrust, are met with you're weird, are met with I don't treat your kind. So many of us just don't go to the doctor. Many of us, when we go to the doctor, we don't tell them our background, we don't tell them who we are, because a lot of us have such negative experiences with doctors. So being able to build that trust and being able to feel that you're welcome in a doctor's office and can expect respect and can expect someone to actually care about our health is rare. So that's a little bit of where sterilization comes into play for trans people. And I'm going to end it with that for now.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of commonalities, and I'm glad that you started to tie them all together. The one thing that makes this very unique and amazing, and in some ways better than the UN session, is that we can actually dialogue, and it's not just one way. So I think if people have questions, I'm going to buzz around, and let's ask some difficult questions and some things that we want to tease out a little bit more.
I can run around with the mic too, for anyone.
I can do too. But when
just let the video camera be here.
Yeah. Sure.
Watching from home.
But yeah, one of the things. Does anyone have questions for each other that you want to know more about? Because you know everything now. You know everything now. No, but as also okay, I'm also part of the club of women living with HIV. No, but I understand that kind of going to the doctor and them not understanding, them actually deterring you from what you know as an activist and an advocate for your own, your own health. Then actually it exists on a spectrum, and that deterrence can be anything from a suggestion not to do something to kind of a feeling of guilt and shame about what you do with your body and whether it's your sexual or reproductive practices, and to, on the far end, a forced sterilization and actually a criminalization of your body as well.
To go on further around how doctors become that godlike figure in our lives, and how do we change that, and how do we educate people to change that? A long time ago in sort of HIV activism, I realised that I knew more about HIV than my GP did. and I knew more than my nurse in the hospital. And I knew more, the only person I didn't know any more than was my HIV specialist. So I realised then that it was I had to actually say something. I had to actually tell these people about this disease. But I have a question. Back home in our country, there's because of the stigma and the discrimination that we all kind of face in our own ways. Me being Indigenous, being a woman, being HIV positive, but there's this real concern for our trans family in New Zealand about where do they go when they need rest care or when we age. And I'm just wondering, I don't know if it's something that's talked about over here in America, because I know that a lot of, because I have a lot of relations as well, family members who are trans, and they are really concerned about who's going to look after them when they get older.
Well, I mean, a lot of us have chosen family. I consider myself very fortunate to be part of a wonderful health initiative here in New York called Callan-Ward Community Health Center, which is a health center catering for LGBT people and HIV positive people. It was conceived more than 40 years ago, right before the AIDS crisis hit New York, because gay men were having STDs and didn't feel comfortable going to their doctor. So it started as a volunteer-run clinic in the LGBT center, and is now a 6-floor general practitioner practice with more than 80,000 patient visits a year. So, and as far as I know, we run the largest clinic for primary care facility for trans people in the world, with more than 3,000 trans people who are patients, who come from all over, not just the New York metro area, but people come to Callan-Ward from halfway across the country and from outside of the US. I think it's, I feel very fortunate to be able to have that kind of service in the place where I live, and at the same time, it really makes me angry that not all of us have that in every place where we live, and that doesn't just go for trans people, it also goes for people living with HIV who have similar issues accessing doctors, as I'm sure you all are very familiar with. This experience of having to educate our own healthcare provider about our health issues is really, really annoying. And it takes away a lot of energy, and it takes away a lot of agency, because sometimes you just want to be the patient. And when you go to the doctor because you don't feel well. And when you don't feel well, you need somebody who can take care of you, and not the other way around.
Well, I had a suggestion, actually, which is, if you don't have a wonderful organization where you can go, and you feel you really have access only to people who are not terribly sympathetic, I think one good thing to do would be to take a patient advocate with you, and that could be a friend, it could be a relative, it could be anybody, maybe from a local organization, maybe it's somebody who's not terribly knowledgeable, but even having somebody else there to ask questions, to take notes, and to be support, I think changes the dynamic in the relationship a little bit. And I've heard recently about a project here that I think is very interesting. It's called the Doula Project. And doulas are women who essentially assist other women through childbirth, but they're not midwives, they're emotional support. And when I spoke to a doula about this, she said, well, there's also another doula project, and that is there's the doula abortion project to help women who are facing, abortion. And there could be a million of these different kinds of doula projects consisting of patient advocates. In the old days, we used to do this. We would go with people to the gynecologist or whatever, just for emotional support, even if there wasn't anything, terribly substantive that we could offer. And then as time went on, we were able to do that. And it does change the dynamic. The other thing is that medical education needs to change on some of these things. And I think that activism amongst medical students, who will be the next generation of doctors, is really important. Nursing students, who will be the next generation of caregivers. So I think those would be really good pressure points.
I have a question. And also remember it's open to you as well. I just wanted to know a question to the panel. Do you feel represented in mainstream reproductive justice movements or feminist movements? If so, how? And if not, how not? And who have they left behind?
I'm always pointing out that the large gap in a lot of things is Indigenous women. And I think what happens is it gets so homogenized into general society. But the reality is that the social health determinants of Indigenous people actually put them at a different level and even put them vulnerable to HIV. Now, question around reproductive rights, I do not feel represented as an Indigenous woman and not as a woman living with HIV even in mainstream.
I have the same, I believe the same, and I have a problem with having different movements like sexual reproductive health movement, feminist movement, because we end up working in silos and everybody focuses on their own movement thing, yet talking about the same person, which is woman, the movement, women movement. It's a very huge movement, but talking about different issues that are affecting different form of women, but not converging together and seeing where do we go moving forward. And one of the, when we were talking about forced and coerced sterilization in Africa, some of the movement that we thought was supposed to be supporting us were actually saying, yeah, women living with HIV should not be bad. And that was, it was shocking to us. And because we really had a backlash from the government and from the agencies that were reported as sterilizing women, but we did not get that support even to stand with us and say, yeah, you're right, you have your rights. However, we have individual movements and women and other groups that are really supporting us, but we were sort of scared that it didn't go the way we were expecting.
Well, this is a tougher question for me. Once upon a time, I did feel that there were organizations that did speak for me. I haven't been active recently, so I can't say that I do feel that way now. I mean, certainly when I look at my emails, I don't get much from the mainstream reproductive rights organizations in this country that I feel address my concerns. But there are a couple of smaller organizations that at least partially begin to address it. One of them would be the National Women's Health Network, which has maintained a presence not so much outside Washington, but in Washington, as the voice of women's health to the legislature and to the FDA on drugs and devices, particularly. And they have a great deal of expertise. So in that small regard, I do feel that somebody speaks for me, but only in that particular way. With the, I don't want to say demise, but with the dispersal, of everybody who did belong to SESA and CARASA, that really dissipated. And I don't see it. I see little remnants of it, but I don't see a large, coalition with a lot of force behind it.
I think for trans people, there's two different questions here: the reproductive justice movement and feminist movement, and there's problems with parts of both movements. In the reproductive justice movement, there's a sizable number of trans people who want to conceive their own children, transitioning to your preferred gender can make that very complicated. One part because the whole process is so gendered in our culture. Pregnant means you have to be a woman in our culture. When in practice, that's not necessarily the case. There are many examples of trans men who have become pregnant, who have had their own children. Either before medically transitioning, or after taking hormones for a while, or after having had chest surgery. There are many trans women who like to have their own children, and who either stop taking hormones or who freeze their sperm for later use. And that has often been met with, but you don't want children, you're trans. So having access to supportive reproductive health care and to families and friends and an environment that supports our wish to have children, that's really something that's very rare, and a lot of us don't have that. As far as feminist movements are concerned, I think in modern day feminist movements there's a bit of a split happening right now. There's a part of the movement that's fully embracing trans people, both trans women and trans men, as part of feminist movements and or allies. But there's also a group in the feminist movement that's very anti-trans, especially anti-trans women, who hold steady to this notion that only women who have been born women can be true women and experience the women thing that all women share. And are at the same time very exclusionary of trans women, and say the nastiest things. And so I think there's a problem there, a big problem, because some of these anti-trans feminists are quite prominent and have a quite big podium and stage that they can spew the hatred from. So at the same time, there's a very progressive and supportive part of feminist movements that are embracing the notion that gender is more than binary, that women come in all kinds of identities, shapes, forms, and that this diversity is what makes feminism so rich.
I want to appreciate the issue of Puerto Rico. One of my mom's aunts, she was sterilized when she was 22 in the 50s. So yeah, I don't know. So I have like two questions. Why do you think government haven't been successful by addressing this issue? And number two, what do you think it takes to enforce sterilization?
Well, in the case of trans people, ending forced sterilization usually goes through the courts. It very seldomly goes through legislature. The German law has had so many, there have been so many high court cases against that law that virtually only the word "and" still stands. I mean, it's a very simple law. It only has 2 paragraphs and 5 subparagraphs or something like that. And there have been at least 5 high court cases against that law, and all have been won. So I think for trans people going through legal processes has really made a huge difference. Educating healthcare providers is much more difficult because it involves changing people's minds, and that takes time.
Here in New York, forced sterilization is not only unlawful, it's actually a minor crime. So it is actually a misdemeanor here. I don't know that anybody has actually been prosecuted for it. But it's very clear. I mean, I will get you the text of the statute, that people who are not accorded, the kind of informed consent, the kind of information that the law requires, and it's really very specific, have actually become, I hate to use the word, I mean, victims of a criminal, criminal activity. Elsewhere, I think, it's a mass movement kind of thing. The only reason we got it here was that we kept up this barrage of publicity for a couple of years. We kept it up very steadily in the newspapers, on the radio, with the city council. So I think it does take, a certain level of consistent organizing, and particularly people who've been in that situation. I mean, as some people here who are willing to talk about it, to come forward and say exactly what it means to them. Because one of the ways in which this is perpetuated is, oh, it's a nothing. It doesn't really have any terrible effect. That's not true. I mean, even in the Puerto Rican situation, there was a very significant, what was called regret rate. Regret rate is something they actually measure in studies. And if people had been given the information they wanted, if they had been given the space and the time and the support, they wouldn't have had a regret rate of about 33%, which is pretty high. So I think ultimately it's an organizing question. And there's just no substitute really for, engaging as many people as you possibly can in it. I don't want to make the mistake of saying the broadest possible coalition, because we had that discussion earlier. I mean, there were some people you actually might not want in the coalition. They're not always very helpful. But otherwise, it really should be as broad as possible, and it should be sustained. Most people do recognize, I think, that unconsented to invasive surgery under these conditions is really, a serious infringement of human rights.
I think the governments have been making sure that their documents, their policies, their guidelines, but we saw that is not enough. Because some countries have these very good documents, policies, but implementation is the issue. And so I don't know, calling for the implementation of these guidelines would be the key, but I don't know it will fall into deaf ears, because that has been done by so many women and men as well. But I was thinking also, like thinking who else is not in this discussion that should be, you know, because we are talking about a huge group of religious leaders who talk about other reproductive health issues like when does life start, you know, like all this discussion. But when it comes to violations of reproductive health rights of some groups, then they are quiet. And so thinking, probably we need to sort of bring this together, the feminist movement, the women's rights movement, so that we speak in one voice. However, the issue of forced and coerced sterilization, way forward I'm seeing is the issue of litigation in the highest court possible, and that would sort of raise the bar for governments and push them to know that women know their rights, and actually educating these women to demand for their rights.
Just quickly, I like to go back to what Eustace was saying. The reality is, even with legislations, even with good training, even with good laws, whenever you're discussing something to do with gender, sexuality, a disease that is transmitted sexually, it brings in a person's moral judgment value system. So for me, educating health professionals, and you can talk to them till you're blue in the face if they're not going to actually challenge their own value systems or what they've been brought up, what they believe, and actually say, well, oh, sorry, I didn't realise I was being discriminatory. They're never going to hear you. And I think it's movements such as ICW, such as all the work that people have been doing, just need to get louder to say these things, that it's not right, it's not okay. You don't have the right to make a moral and judgment decision on my body. It's as simple as that. And the more that we say that to somebody who thinks that they're actually helping us, remember they signed, what is it, the Hippocratic Oath? I mean, it's saving our lives. You know, it's actually reminding them that they aren't up here, they are here. They're there for us. And as I meet women, so many women living with HIV, who have that complete paradigm the wrong way around. And I'm like, no, you go back and tell that doctor you don't want to do that. You know, don't just go, yes, okay, you're the God. But again, even when you're teaching about sexuality, gender, and other things around this topic, sorry, switching to my language sometimes, in cultural paradigms, it's taboo, it's sacred. Talking about sex is just not done in some places. And it's not just in my culture, that's cultures all around the world. And it's like, how do we get people to talk about that in a healthy way so that we can all stay healthy?
Hi. Actually, you're starting to already talk about this, so I can just keep going. We can imagine the role of organized religion and the negative ways that it's impacting this movement, and feel free to talk more about that. But I think we're also starting to get what are the ways in which spirituality and faith have been helpful or can be of service.
Actually, I was in a meeting the other day with a group of people that make a lot of decisions around policies for care of people living with HIV, and I said to them, you can't just treat me as a biomedical person, you have to treat me as a holistic person. My mental, emotional health, my physical body, my spirituality, and my family and support that is around me has to be treated as well. They have to understand what is going on. And culture, law, and religion has a lot of impact on a lot of people's different lives. And I suppose from my, I put my Indigenous glasses on, is that what I see is that I like to tell people about stories about our trans people and our history. So I bring up stories of that we were taught as kids. We actually have songs about people who were trans, and it was completely normal. For us, it was like, it's like this in the Samoan community. If you had only sons, it means one of those sons had to be a girl.
and they were basically made to live as a girl, and it's whawhawhine. It's actually culturally, it was so entrenched in our history. So when I come up against someone, especially in my culture, who has that sort of homophobic, religious type of view, I say to them, oh, because you know, in New Zealand it's 2 degrees of separation. We all know someone who knows someone. I say, oh, you know so-and-so, oh yes. Oh, you know, they were gay, or you know, they were actually trans, and then, oh, were they? Oh, yeah, they were too, yeah. And I remember I was sitting at a table with an elder, and what I'm getting at is that we actually, they don't even realise that they have kind of, on some level, completely just, oh yeah, and just gone on with life and accepted you. But their beliefs and their values and what they're saying through their mouth is, oh no, we can't have that here. And I went to an elder's house, and I sat at the table with him, and he was giving, oh, you know, I don't think you should be doing HIV education around here. You know, you're going to encourage all our kids to go to Auckland and become gay. And I was like, what? And I said, what do you mean? How did you get that to that? But because the association with HIV straight away for him was gay. And I said, well, let's talk about that. And then in walked this most beautiful trans woman, granddaughter, served us this beautiful meal. And I'm sitting here listening to this homophobic claptrap, and I went, what about? And, oh, he's white. He's one of us. And I said, that is exactly it. When we start accepting that we are all one of us, and that there's no difference, and that we actually, if we went through our family history, or we went through our connections, we would see that there is one of us somewhere along the line. Actually, I'm very religious, I might say, and one of the things that I keep thinking about when I think about what I believe in religion is what the good book keeps on talking about, and the love that, you know, like that is taught. And I wonder what happened to it, and where did it go, and where does the demarcation comes in, to think that these are certain kind of people that should not be loved the way the good book, whichever it is, that it says. And I think in various ways that religion can be very helpful, especially in our setting, because it has a huge following. And you know, like the platform will be the best place to like voice the message, for people to know their rights, for people to know where to get access to support, to services, and even for acceptance within the community. That's a very big, you know, like a very good opportunity that is never utilized because of their own attitudes and beliefs that I don't think they're explained anywhere in the religion cycle, anywhere. But also, the other thing that I see in our African setup is that, like the religious, or call them the Christian or whatever, they have a big ear or listening from our governments, wherever it is. And so they would do actually better than sit down and think who should not have an abortion, who should not be a trans, and who should not be gay. They should be talking to the government for the rights of the people, for the rights of their followers, because these are the same people who come out to their churches, who give them the tithes. And they don't say they are gay or they are trans openly because of the stigma in the society. They are in those churches. And so they are missing out a big opportunity. And that's why I say probably we need to have like more conversation, you know, like with the rights movement. Because I think when, as women living with HIV, when we talk to them, they might listen as compared to a transgender organization. So like having those conversations together and seeing where we can converge and raise the issues of certain communities.
Here, there, I think, have long been certain parts of progressive churches that have been helpful, have been useful. They usually sign on as supporters. They offer resources and so on. I'm sure that some of the clergy would be happy on occasion to speak about some of the issues. And that's, of course, not yet as loud a group as those religious people who have been militating, so hatefully against gay rights, against reproductive rights, against trans rights, and so on. I really don't think in this country that there is anything that can actually be done, with that hardcore segment of the religious community that seems to be motivated by hate instead of, as you say, by the love that should motivate them. I think the only thing we can do is overshadow them or outnumber them or make noises larger than they are. Today in the Times, I thought there was a wonderful article about the fact that finally the Boston St. Patrick's Day Parade had its first gay contingents, and people were celebrating all over Boston. So change is happening, even in places, that have long been resistant. I think we need to play it up a whole lot. And for those clergy or those congregations that have lent a hand, maybe to ask them to be more upfront about it, more public about it.
I'd like to approach it from a slightly different angle, and that is that, in my experience, both as a lesbian activist and a trans activist, certain conservative circles have had much less of an issue with transsexual people than they've had with gays or lesbians, because there are people who are very attached to a binary system, black and white, male and female, yes or no, right or wrong, white or black, and who are very, their mindset is very structured in such a binary way. And for them, it's actually easier to understand that somebody would want to transition from woman to man, or from man to woman, as long as that person adheres to their idea of what that gender is. As long as they reinforce that binary, they're sort of okay with it. They can wrap their heads around it. But as soon as people break out of that binary, as soon as people say, well, I'm sort of a woman, or I'm sort of a man, or I'm sort of somewhere in between, I'm sort of outside of that whole gender system, I don't really attach to either of that, they go berserk. And I think that's really the problem with organized conservatism that disguises itself as religion. But I wanted to come back to one question that you posed, which is who's not in the room, which I think is such an important question that all of us need to ask ourselves all the time. And it's so easy to forget that question because it's so easy to get caught up in the people who you're already engaged with. I think one group that experiences a lot of queer's forced sterilization are people with disabilities, especially people with learning disabilities and mental disabilities. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that that there's a huge problem there, that that many people are not willing to tackle or to take on because of that old eugenics argument that seems to be so rooted so deep in many people's beliefs, and even for me, who comes from a firm anti-sterilization viewpoint, who grew up with a father with a disability, it took me a while to wrap my head around that. the right of people with mental disabilities to have children. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge in our own work.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments about that. That area is much more complicated, ultimately, I think, than all the other questions we have about forced sterilization. And it's really because there's a huge spectrum of abilities and disabilities. There are some people who, with additional counseling and additional help, can learn to bring up children. There are people who will, successfully have and enjoy sex. And then finally, at the far, far end of the spectrum are people with very deep disabilities, and many of them are institutionalized. And in institutions, there is a great deal of abuse. And part of the problem there is that nobody reports this abuse. Certainly, people who are abused aren't always able to report it. So one of the things we used to see was parents and the heads of institutions coming forward and saying, we need not only to sterilize these people, but we need to do hysterectomies because we don't want anybody getting pregnant, which I used to find infuriating because it meant that they were willing to tolerate rape without ever mentioning that there was anything that they could or would do about it, or anything about how people needed to be protected, and that they were willing to, provide some kind of security to avoid that. The other issue, to be blunt about it, when people are in public institutions, is expense. And public budgets are not getting any bigger these days. They are getting smaller. And it puts a lot of pressure on the institutions and on the parents of people who are in these institutions to take some kind of step. I haven't heard a lot about this lately, and I think maybe one of the reasons is that now, as opposed to in the 70s, we have long-acting contraceptives. So there could be Depo-Provera shots, there could be implantable contraceptives, and other kinds of contraceptives, some of which would actually stop menstruation, which from the point of view of caretakers, is a good thing. Whether that's true for the women involved, I don't always know, but most of what you read in the court cases about this and in the literature really has to do with convenience of caretakers. And when those caretakers are parents, particularly if they're poor parents, I think this is maybe the most difficult series of issues possible in this area. I have a question for you. In your country, how is health care paid for? And is there, as far as you know, any government program or government money that's involved in the sterilizations?
That's a good question. And most of our health programs, for example, when it comes to HIV programs or social programs and health programs, most of it is donor funded, like 95% is donor funded, mainly from PEPFAR, Global Fund, and other donors. And so most of these programs are really free for the communities to access. However, we have like a big percentage of people who do not access these programs because when a certain limit is reached, then they don't like stick in more. However, in other health programs like in family planning, in maternal health, then individual people have to pay for their own programs. And unlike here, where the issue of insurance is quite important to everyone, it is not the same back home. And so one of the things that happens is families are able to look for resources to support their own if they need any financial support to access health services. But I wanted to mention about forced coerced sterilization and actually how it originated in Kenya. It actually started with an organization that was being funded from here to Africa.
Do you know which one? Do you know?
I think the organization was called Project Prevention. Yeah, and it is a US-based organization, and what they did is they used to come, and I think they're still operating until we made a lot of noise and they're sort of quiet. They would come to certain places where we have very high incidences of HIV. Then they would target women living with HIV and tell them to be in groups and support them to start economic empowerment activities or income generating activities, and actually would give them $40 to start a business, which sometimes in the rural areas, maybe they can start a fish business, grocery business, and then when you're given that money, then they would be sterilized, all the 10 of them. And that is the genesis of sterilization in Africa and in Kenya by large. So, and I think it comes back to what you are presenting, that someone sits here in New York and think that African women are giving birth to so many children and they need to be stopped, and the best way to do this is to entice them to this money. And so that is how some of them are being sterilized. However, we also have like US-based funded organizations that are taking lead even in the court cases that we have currently in Kenya. I didn't want to mention these cases because they are ongoing and we are not allowed to talk about them. But the women who have sued these organizations and the government at large, those organizations are mostly US-based funded. They operate through US funding. So those are some of the dynamics we are facing in the country.
Thank you, Lucy.
I just want to go back to the issue around disability. I think what doesn't get talked about is that for the first sort of 20 years of the epidemic, people living with HIV were considered, in my country anyway, as a disability. And I think the disability around the sterilisation is, well, again, judgment and moralistic, is that we are, well, in my case, I'll give you my example. The first child that I had, people would go up to my mother and say, I was irresponsible for having a child because I'm going to die soon, because I had this disability that's going to kill me soon. And I really have seen, since we've started medication, since we're living longer, since we're becoming more active and we're getting stronger with our activism, and changing the attitude of that we're a victim, or and still in my country for trans, you have to be declared under the Mental Health Act before you can get hormonal treatment. So the DSM-4, you know, they have to be. And so there's those sorts of things, and it's time for us to actually start saying, no, we're not victims anymore. I don't have a disability. I have a virus in the blood that is undetectable, so how am I not any different to anyone else?
All right, so thanks. We have to wrap this up.
If anyone has like a pressing question. We have
pressing question. I've been really good at not talking too much. But one thing that I've been thinking about listening to this panel, you know, when we talk about reproductive justice, is access to like abortion, you know, to have or to not have, you know, the birthing of a child. And I was just thinking, you know, how for some people it can be really difficult to get an abortion, but for others it can be, you know, forced and coerced abortions can be quite a bit easier. And I know for, you know, people with disabilities, women living with HIV and so on, it's indigenous women, yeah, like poor people who use drugs, these kind of, the rules shift and they alter quite a bit. So I guess we're just gonna have to wrap up. So maybe we can end with a final question of what do you think that we need to do in order to move forward? How can we collectively talk about reproductive justice in a different way, or maybe the same way, I don't know. But yeah, and your final thoughts.
Very quickly, and I'd like to elaborate a bit more on what Teresia was saying. Throughout the CSW and all the meetings I've been to for the last week, the divisions of each movement, the silos that everyone's working in, and in my Indigenous mind, I can't work in silos because I'm a woman, I'm Indigenous, and I'm HIV, so I can't just turn off my Indigenous side and come over here and be HIV positive, and I can't come over here and be a woman. So I'm just, the picture that I'm seeing is that there has to be some kind of place of collaboration, or some kind of place where all our different movements are weaved together. I've got this picture of a weaved map because I'm Pacific Island, but how we've been putting these beautiful banners together, and thank you very much, by the way. Can we have a hand for people who did that? The process of actually creating something together, and without losing our autonomy, without losing our identity. I can support you as a trans woman or a trans man. I can support you as an African woman living in sub-Saharan Africa. We can do that through that weaving process together.
And as the international community of women living with HIV, we have a strong presence in the internet, Facebook, Twitter, and I think that is one of the ways that we need to raise our voices. And you can join our Facebook or Twitter pages to discuss, to continue the discussion, and really to spread the word even further. And also, like when I sit here in New York, and there's so many other women in my community, like in the rural women in the community, I'm thinking, how can we also reach those women with the same information who cannot access Twitter or Facebook or cannot come even to New York? And so thinking of a way of engaging even further beyond the usual groups would be really the thing to do.
I think there was one avenue that kind of opened up as I heard you speaking, and that is that there are things that are beginning here that are having their effects there. And we, not only are people in Kenya dealing with it, but we can deal with it too. This has happened before. Actually, there was a SISA chapter in St. Louis that took on an AID program that was training doctors to do massive numbers of sterilizations in developing countries and giving them very elaborate equipment far beyond what they would have been able to afford themselves, laparoscopes and so on. And that chapter took on that program, picketed that university, and exposed that program. And I think, in international solidarity, we should do the same kinds of things. I mean, if there's a funding source for it here, we should go after it here, we should expose it here.
When I was very fortunate to have attended a hui in New Zealand, which is a gathering of in this case of trans activists from the region. And one thing that I learned there was the power of song. And one song that really stuck with me is called Te Aroa, which the song is very short. It's the words are love, faith, and peace be amongst us all. And if you would permit me, I would like to sing with you. Yeah. Te aroa, ke whakapono, me te rangi mai.
I think that is the perfect way to end. And if anything that we can take from this is, you know, we need to be united, see people as people, and have a generosity of spirit and fill this world with kindness instead of hate. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the panelists. You are wonderful, inspiring, and amazing. And I absolutely look forward to working more with you and, you know, doing the great things that we gotta do.
Yeah. Thank you, Jessica. Also, there is another student-organized lecture happening in the near future, Dark Matter, which is a queer South Asian poetry duo, is going to be here on April 30th. The event is free and open to the public. They're touring their show it's called It Gets Bitter, and it's about resisting homonormativity and things like that.
They're amazing, go see them.
They're really great. Thank you guys so much for coming.